For a tiny island nation situated in the South Atlantic, the British Overseas Territory of the Falkland Islands has one of the strongest economies in the world relative to its size. Boasting one of the highest gross national incomes per capita, the islands rival nations such as Luxembourg and the Republic of Ireland. But it's the location of this island nation that might have more to say about the reasons for its success. A reliance on the ocean for fishing and an expanding multi-million-pound tourism industry has paved the way to an economic stronghold. But how much more will the islands need to diversify in order to maintain their coveted prosperity?
In the last episode, we discussed the impact of the pandemic on the economy and the varied challenges associated with the country's geographical isolation and environment. Other pressures, such as the impact of climate change on industry, were also noted amid growing demands for the sustainable management of natural resources. But in the final episode of this series, ideas around economic diversification and sustainability will be broadened as we look into the work that is already being undertaken to support the islands in its pursuit for a greener economic vision.
Sustainability has become increasingly important for our future. Our industries, economies, and very way of life now depend on it more than ever. A scarcity of resources and of course climate change will continue to affect our choices and the way we are able to live our lives. But it's our ability to employ greener practices that will ultimately determine our future. And this is a journey that the Falkland Islands must embrace.
We could look at what countries are already doing to try and encourage this kind of behaviour. I don't think we need to be too revolutionary in what we take on, and whether it is reduced tax for certain cars, or having subsidies available to try and encourage it, making sure that there's more charging points available to create the right conditions for people to be able to use these things. These are things we could look at quite seriously. But I think that's the way that the future is going. So making sure people are prepared for that move is also going to be essential.
Technology has a large part to play in the transition process. Greener economies rely on improved technological solutions that can be incorporated into everyday life. One aspect of this includes transport and our ability to make it more environmentally friendly. Sam Cockwell is the project coordinator at eLink. The company, established in 2021, looks to help the islands transition from a reliance on imported fuels to electric vehicles. As part of his role, Sam promotes sustainable travel within the agricultural industry.
This is the UBCO 2x2. UBCO stands for Utility Bike Company, designed and built in New Zealand, so aimed at the kind of farming community really, and also holidayers. It's very popular with RVers in the States, and we brought a couple of bikes down to in partnership with UBCO to basically try it out, see how it goes, and see how it does with our environment. On a relatively sort of small to medium-sized farm where you're not doing like hundreds of miles a day on a bike, it gives you that advantage that you're not having to handle petrol, you're not having to get oils in, you're not having to do that sort of stuff. So for islands, I think it's a really good option. And for the smaller and medium farms as well, because you can literally just go out, hop on it, beep, and off you go. Effectively, if you've got a renewable system, you fuel your bike for free.
The use of this bike in camp could serve as an opportunity to make farm work more environmentally friendly. Being fully electric, it does not require any use of petrol or diesel and actually draws less energy than most household appliances, taking only 6 hours to charge. This could help reduce carbon emissions while farmers drive many miles to complete their normal agricultural duties. But the added benefit of this technology is its ease of use in remote locations like the Falklands. In camp, most settlements already have the infrastructure to support renewable technology, such as solar panels and windmills. This could make it easier to integrate the Upco bike into everyday farm living without the need for expensive construction or redevelopment.
I think on the whole, from the technology and people's enthusiasm for sustainability and looking towards using our energy more wisely, people are very keen. The feedback is always really positive in terms of, oh, okay, right, I understand now that you can, an electric car isn't a step down or a step back. If anything, it's probably a bit of a step forward in terms of like power and how it feels and ease of driving and comfort and all that stuff. So we've seen even people who are real sort of diesel heads and real petrol heads have still said, actually, yeah, this is actually really good. We've seen a few people who are real converts to it, which is really exciting. What the 2x2 means is two-wheel drive. So you've got hub motors, one at the back here and one at the front in the middle of the wheels. And that's where all your driving power comes from. So you effectively got a motor, well, you've got a motor on each wheel. And then the main power is in the middle, in the battery. So this is a removable battery, which slides in and out very easily. You just disconnect the connection there, and then it just pulls out. And basically that gives you, that's everything. I mean, that's all the moving parts of the bike. That's all the exciting stuff. Most of these technologies are cheaper to run, more efficient, and easier to maintain. So kind of like, well, I mean, once you get the purchase price parity there, yeah, I think that's the tipping point, and then you start really seeing adoption, kind of generally speaking. You have to choose then to want to have, a kerosene boiler or a petrol car or like a generator rather than solar panels and stuff like that. So that's kind of I think that making that capital cost, like you say, especially in the current world with the cost of living, is absolutely the way that you help sustainable products and help consumers adopt them.
While the uptake of electric vehicles like this one behind me remains small scale at the moment, there is hope that as technology gets cheaper, more people in the islands will decide to use them. E-Link's electric biking is just one example of how more traditional industries can be developed with sustainability in mind. But this solution may not be as applicable in other areas. Global industries like fishing and mining, for example, usually require a large amount of natural resources for their operations and have a large carbon footprint. These factors can sometimes create barriers when it comes to meeting goals for sustainability, but that doesn't mean that these goals can't be met. It just requires a tailored approach and a bit of creative thinking.
So we set sort of like a standard. We've got 60 of those sacks that are, they're sacks that are normally used for toothfish. But you can put a good amount of tussock in there, and we load them at Green Island, which is like 10 minutes away by launch.
Joost Pompert is the general manager of Georgia Seafoods, a fishing company partly based in the Falkland Islands. And for the past 3 years, he and his company have teamed up with wildlife charity Falklands Conservation in a tussock planting initiative. The aim of the project is to protect islands from wind erosion, which due to historic overgrazing and burning contributes to the emission of carbon.
We engaged with Falklands Conservation, who happened to have an island which badly needed restoration, and had that not happened, that island would have continued to emit carbon simply because the peat is exposed, and exposed peat degrades and so on. And so by actually starting with that restoration process on Middle Island, those emissions have effectively halted for the areas that have been covered.
While the planting of tussock will help to restore Middle Island and its habitat for plants and animals, it is also hoped that a carbon offsetting scheme could be implemented. As a sector, it's difficult for the fishing industry to reduce their carbon emissions due to the present necessity of fossil fuels in shipping. But despite this, Georgia Seafoods is looking at the possibility of offsetting their emissions through the capturing of carbon in the tussock planting initiative.
When you restore it with, in this case, tussock, I mean you could plant trees too for argument's sake, but in this case with tussock, you stabilize the soil so it stops emitting carbon from that fact alone, and then it starts to also the uptake of carbon also starts because the plants themselves, they take up carbon, and in due course they will start form peat and retain soil. So over the course of 5, 10, 15, 20 years, a certain amount of carbon is actually stored. And so this is when we talk about the offsetting scheme.
While the concept of carbon offsetting looks promising, currently there is still more data and research that must be obtained before it can be fully put into practice.
At the moment, we don't have the evidence to know whether areas that we're doing are still emitting. So we actually don't know whether we're, whether we're carbon whether we're able to retain the carbon, or if we're emitting more than is being stored. Obviously, these huge big bogs in these areas have massive amounts of carbon in them. But in terms of schemes, there's still quite a lot of work to do to work out what that means. Whether people, in terms of offsetting, we're not at that stage yet. But those sort of things, hopefully, will be really important and will be something that we can benefit from in terms of carbon storage and potentially offsetting. But at the moment, it's just as important to get things in the ground. So irrelevant to what may happen or what we may find out, we still need to get things in the ground. So that's what we're working towards.
I mean, everybody has their own way of doing it, but certainly on Bleaker we found that it's just as easy. Put a spade in, wriggle it about a bit so you've got a reasonable hole, and then tamping it down once you've got it in. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, here we are. So the carbon capture of peat and things is really quite incredible. I hadn't realised just how important peat was and tussock.
So many people come to the Falkland Islands to see the wildlife. So much of our economy depends on the wildlife here. And native wildlife is so much better dealing with climate change, native habitats, native wildlife. And so even though it's fabulous to be able to do all this, it is such a small area of the Falkland Islands overall. So that's why it's so special. That's why it's so important.
While ideas like carbon offsetting have the potential to make a substantial impact, it is also vital that the government play its role through the development of new types of policy.
Our last economic development strategy was kind of end date around 2025, and so we're just coming around to starting to think about kind of the next version of that. If you look back over the past years, you will see that the strategies are quite similar kind of across the years, and I'd like to this time take a slightly different approach and thinking through how kind of historically government has played a really dominant role in economic development, which kind of makes sense given the history of the islands, but thinking through kind of what the role of government is versus the private sector versus FIDC as kind of bridging those two and working in partnership to develop a strategy that is forward-looking but also flexible and adaptable, because I think one of the challenges is that
You can go around and chase specific opportunities, but you also need to be open to what the world brings you. Being in a position to take advantage of those opportunities or respond to those threats as they emerge is really going to be critical. I think after the start of the year, starting to have some of those conversations about kind of where we want to go from here, and maybe starting from a blank page rather than kind of going back to what we've always done.
There's a lot more to be done. I think we've learned that relearned something we've always known, which is Falkland Islanders are incredibly resourceful, and we can turn our hands and we can overcome problems. And I think we want to make sure we can keep that for the future, because you never know what might be around the corner, and whether it's having to deal with climate change or whether it's having to deal with a pandemic or new geopolitical threats being thrown over the water. We have to be able to adapt and prosper, and it's something we can do well.
We've all got a part to play in the energy transition in terms of how we use energy, exploring new technologies, and we all have a responsibility to look at what we do and think about our impact. I've got a young child, and I genuinely want him to see the Falklands in the way that I did as a child, or better. I think if we can all think about how am I going to leave the Falklands as a better place, or as a not worse place, when you're handing it on to the next generation, then that's a good way to think about it.
Nobody can precisely predict the trajectory of the Falkland Islands economy, or whether it will indeed reach its long-term goal of increased economic diversification. As the world evolves and shifts, there will always be challenges that remain on the horizon. But it's perhaps these very challenges that enable the development of new ideas and opportunities to form. What is certain, however, is the ever-growing role that sustainability must play in the development of the global economy. Now, more than ever, we have to find ways to meet the needs of today without compromising the needs of the future.